those were the notes that you played. You know, those kinds of things happened in the 60s. So as a bookend to the, let's say that 1913 was the beginning of the 20th century era. For me, I've had a real watershed moment. And very interestingly enough, I just read an article online this week that totally validates my feeling. The person who wrote this article had the same experience that I did, which is in the mid-1970s, an American composer named David Del Tredici wrote a series of pieces that were all inspired by and based upon Alice in Wonderland. And I heard the most famous of those pieces is called Final Alice. It's an orchestral piece. And it's totally based on traditional triadic harmony, 1-3-5, the basic harmony that music throughout history has been based on. And it kind of returned to a more listenable, very approachable style. And this is, I think it was written in 1974. I probably heard this piece in 75, 76. And it was like, wow, how brave of him to actually have the nerve to write in an older style. Although I shouldn't say older style, just to return to traditional triadic harmonies, standard harmonies, as a way to create his piece. And so that for me was kind of the beginning of that, oh, maybe we can emerge from the dark ages of the 50s and 60s when music was so difficult. Then, of course, at the end of the 1970s, the minimalist composers, Philip Glass, Terry Riley, began writing their music based again on the one da 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 da. That's a Philip Glass piece. Da 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 da. That based on those traditional harmonies that we know and are familiar with. And then, again, for me personally, the big moment was John Adams, who was trained at Yale, but then took a position teaching composition at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music in the late 70s. He began writing music which emerged as really beautiful and wonderful and interesting. Commentators today do not call his music minimalist in the same way that Philip Glass's music is minimalist. But it kind of is pared down in that same way. It's really beautiful. And so that began the shift into what I am calling the contemporary music era that we are in now. For sake of argument, let's just say that by 1980, enough shift had been made, and specifically in the choral music world, that starting at around 1980, composers began producing music which is very listenable, very approachable on the first hearing. And so that's what I'm calling, the program we're doing today is contemporary music. It's music written since 1980 for the most part. So that's 34 years of music history. We're in this current period now. Who knows how long it will go. But it could go 100 years or 150 years or longer, as the Baroque era did, etc. So, of course, having said that, here's the exception to the rule. There are a couple of outliers. And in fact, the piece that I began programming this concert from was written in 1938. So way back in earlier times. But when you hear it, it sounds very much similar to the style that the rest of the pieces are on the program. This is a work by Paul Hindemith, German composer, his Six Chansons, the 6 songs of Paul Hindemith. He was a German composer, and he was in the mid-1930s, he was on his way fleeing Nazi Germany. And his wife was Jewish, so he was uncomfortable in Germany at the time. So he ended up moving to Switzerland. And while he was in Switzerland, he came across the poetry of Rainer Maria Rilke, who of course is a German poet. Rilke, however, had lots of connections to Switzerland, and he in fact wrote 400 of his poems are in French. So Hindemith is living in Switzerland and comes across the French poems of Rilke, and then while he's there set these beautiful 6 songs for a cappella choir that are really, I consider to be among the great works of 20th century, part of the essential pieces of the canon of choral music in the 20th century. So I really wanted to do those pieces. I had not sung them since I first sang them in high school, and I sang them again in college. Had not done them since. So I wanted to introduce this group to those pieces. And from that I said, well, let's do a whole program of contemporary pieces. So, in fact, we have a couple of pieces that are from the 1980s, 2 or 3 that are from the 1990s, and the rest are all from the 21st century. Except for the very last piece on our concert was written in 1970, and which is interesting. I'll talk about it more in a minute. So it's rhythmically very interesting, and if you think about it, the times at the end of the 60s that this person was writing. It makes sense. So, anyway, around 1980, composers began to return to music which was much more listenable and approachable on the first hearing. I think you'll find everything tonight is like that. My own personal take is, however, and more in the last 10 years, I've been hearing composers write music which is pretty, and it's really pretty. And then there's more pretty, and then there's more pretty, and it just becomes unrelentingly pretty to the point that I get kind of bored after a while. So I like a little spice in my music, and so some of the pieces we're doing today are in that very pretty mode, and you're going to love them, and they're very moving. However, I did try to sprinkle in, kind of alternatingly at least, or somehow sprinkle in, some pieces that have more what I call spice. That might mean more rhythmic interest, more exciting rhythms, or my own favorite thing is thicker harmonies, chords that go beyond just the 1, 3, 5, the triad, but add in extra notes based on jazz harmonies and that kind of thing. Happily, because we're looking at contemporary music, it is possible to program a lot of music composed by women and set to poetry written by women. In earlier eras, it's not impossible to find women composers, but it's very difficult. And I am excited on this program to be able to feature some women composers and also feature some of the poetry of some of our great American poets, both male and female. Among those, I really would like to point out to you, there's a piece that's new to me, and the composer is new to me. Her name is Stacy Garup, and she lives in Chicago. She's a little bit younger than me, I believe, and she's developed quite a career in the choral world. I just want to make sure you listen to her pieces. They're really interesting, very well set, and that she's a name to look out for. I just learned that she has a piece that Chanticleer has been performing recently on tour. And also look for her name because she was recently commissioned by the San Francisco Choral Society and the Piedmont Children's Choir to compose a new piece which will be premiered later this year. So you'll hear her music today, remember the name, and when that piece comes up and you read a review, whatever, you'll be able to connect it. Oh yeah, that's that woman that I first heard of at the Bay Choral Guild concert. Stacy Garup is a really interesting composer I'm finding. I'm just learning about her myself. She decided to write works based on the poetry of Edna St. Vincent Millay, great American poet who died in 1950. Millay wrote a bunch of sonnets in her works, a series of works, and Stacy Garup likes her sonnets so much that she has spent since the year 2000 setting a whole series of works based on the sonnets of Edna St. Vincent Millay. So I think there are now, she's up to 8 sets. So today we're hearing one of the sets, which are 3 separate pieces, and those are just 3, but there's 8 total, so you could probably do a whole concert. And in fact, some young man in the Midwest, which is where she's from, has written his entire doctoral dissertation on the music of Stacy Garup, specifically the Edna St. Vincent Millay pieces by Stacy Garup. And it's a 250-page dissertation talking about her methods, her model of writing, and about how she analyzes the poetry and everything. It's really quite fascinating to read this for me as a composer, because her approach is different from my own. She really does a lot of analysis of the poem itself, and then graphs out on a graph sheet the shape of the piece, and where the highs and lows are going to be, and where the emotional content lies within the poetry, how that's going to go. She gets that all mapped out before she ever chooses any pitches or rhythms. And once she knows the shape of the piece, then she goes in and writes in the pitches and rhythms. And the particular sonnets we're going to be hearing tonight are really interesting. They're 3 love songs about different aspects of love. The first one is unreasonable desire. The second one is inconsolable longing. And then the last one is shallow, whimsical romance. So it's really fun, and the way she sets them are really delightful. The first one, the text starts out, "Now by this moon, before this moon shall wane, I shall be dead, or I shall be with you." She's like, really, it's kind of crazy. The second one, which is the inconsolable longing, starts out, "Time does not bring relief. You have all lied who told me time would ease my pain. I miss him in the weeping of the rain. I miss him in the shrinking of the tide." It's kind of that thing. Then the last one is really fun, very whimsical. I shall forget you presently, my dear, so make the most of this, your little day, ere I forget, or die, or move away. So that you kind of get the sense of the emotional impact of each of these three love songs. And when you hear how she has set them, it really is a brilliant, brilliant writing that really sets the mood. There's really interesting rhythmic interest and also harmonic interest. Both are things that I listen for when I'm listening for new music, and I think you'll like these pieces as well. We also have on the program another love sonnet, the famous William Shakespeare, How Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? So that kind of connects in the love sonnet theme. That piece, which is the second piece on the program, is actually one of the two pieces on the show which are more jazz choir in nature. It kind of has jazz harmonies, they're much more relaxed, kind of easy listening, kind of jazzy, which is kind of fun for our group that does mostly straight up sacred music, very formal, to kind of ease into these jazz stylings and enjoy those chords and that style of singing is kind of fun. Let me see. We also have two other great American poets. Sarah Teasdale was a great poet that died in 1933, American poet. Her piece, which is next to last on the show, is one of the last poems that she ever wrote. And she, later in life, was very depressed, had a depressive personality, and struggled with her depression. And in fact, she committed suicide at age 48 because of the depression. But along the way, she held on to hope and to life. She found looking up at the stars and seeing the beauty of the stars and the eternity of the stars gave her hope to get through her life. And the particular piece that we're doing by Frank Ticheli, who's a Southern California composer, professor at USC, has really set very, very profoundly this beautiful music. And I do urge you to read in the program notes about how he dedicated the piece and what happened in his life that caused him to dedicate this piece to a young boy who died, who drowned in a swimming pool. It's really quite touching, beautiful piece. The other woman poet that we're honoring is Emily Dickinson, again, the great American poet. She's from earlier era, of course, she's 19th century. And the piece we're doing by her is the beginning of the second half, is by a friend of mine, a colleague whose name is Michael Culkin, lives in Oakland, very near me. And this piece that he wrote takes this brief two-line poem by Emily Dickinson. It's part of a larger set that Michael wrote that's about friendship. It's called Cycle of Friends, and there's a variety of friends' poems. And right in the middle of this set, which includes orchestra and soloists, is this little a cappella piece, Emily Dickinson, which says, are friends a delight or pain? And so there's that question, well, is friendship a good thing? Friends are helpful, but friends can be a pain as well, and so back and forth. So that's what he was playing with in this piece. So it's kind of a fun, short, brief little moment there. And another American poet that we are honoring is E.E. Cummings, one of my favorite American poets. We're doing, in fact, two different pieces that set E.E. Cummings poems. The first of those is by Eric Whitacre, who is perhaps the most well-known, successful American composers of choral music working today. And this particular piece, he struggled with when he was commissioned to write this piece. He didn't know quite how to make it work. It's part of a set of 3 Cummings pieces. And so what he ended up doing was taking the first 4 words of the poem, which are hope, faith, life, love, and the last 4 words of the poem, which are dream, joy, truth, and soul, and setting those 8 words, that's the entire text, is those 8 words. And what he ended up doing was setting each word as its own section, 2 or 3 or 4 measures, which are this word, and then it moves on to the next word for an extended, longer phrase. And in fact, I know a lot of you are singers, have sung or Eric Whitacre's music, or familiar with his music. Each of these words, they quote a different one of his own pieces. So as we've been working on this piece, we come along a section and say, oh, that seems so familiar. Well, in fact, the reason is because he was quoting himself in other pieces in this. So that's a very easy way to write, I guess, to quote yourself, to use the material you've already come up with. But nonetheless, it's a really, really beautiful piece, and it's very effective. I think you'll enjoy it as well. We're going to begin the show with the settings of poems by William Blake, the great Romantic era English poet, who was not so well known in his lifetime, but has become, since then, well respected by commentators about his mystical poetry. And in fact, the mysticism of his poems attracted the composer, who is a woman from New York City whose name is Nancy Verch. These settings are really delightful, very, very straight ahead, and set the music quite effectively as well. So she's a new composer to me. I'm excited to learn about her, and I hope to do more of her music in the future. Doing the research for this has been eye-opening, trying to get a nice balance of all kinds of things, different kinds of poetry, different kinds of music, and trying to get women equally represented as well on the program. So there's two more poets and pieces that I'd like to talk about. The first is my own composition, which sets the poetry of Charles Baudelaire. So this poem is an interesting poem in his oeuvre. It's Invitation to a Voyage. Baudelaire was also a very depressed person, and he published a whole collection of poems called, the translation is Flowers of Evil. And most of the poems in that set are very tortured and dark, and talk about really difficult, dark things. However, in the middle of this set of poetry, there's this one poem, which is called Invitation to a Voyage, which is much lighter, and it's sort of a love song. The way I interpret it is inviting a loved one to go on a journey to paradise. And as you go through the poem, it talks about the trip itself, what they're going to see, where they're going to go, what they're going to see, and when they arrive, what's going to happen. And it really is I just love the images that were invoked when I read this in translation. But let me be more specific. When I first came across this poem, it was in a book of poetry by Baudelaire in English translation. And in fact, the traditional translation that one usually encounters when you see Invitation to a Voyage was in this book. However, right next to it was a different translation by Edna St. Vincent Millay. We're hearing her poetry separately, but that she also did this translation of this particular poem. What she did was to, rather than be more word-for-word literal translation, which the traditional translation is, when you compare them two side by side, it lines out in a readable English way what Charles Baudelaire was saying. But she took a little bit of a poetic license, artistic license, and reinterpreted it to make it more, to spice up the images in English. And